evening, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Deconstruction Consortium organized by the YLAC Policy Collective, YPC, the SBSC chapter.
For those joining us for the first time, the YPC SBSC is a flagship chapter of the Young Leaders for Active Citizenship YLAC. Our mission is to transform college campuses into vibrant hubs for public policy, leadership, and civic engagement.
Today's session is a part of our IR Discuss Group initiative. This is a student-led platform designed to move beyond textbooks and headlines. We aim to foster dialogues on shifting power dynamics, provide a space where students can analyze, debate, and deconstruct the forces shaping our world today. In an era of polycrisis and rapid change, there is no better way to start than by looking at the defining relationship of the 21st century, India and China.
This session is conducted in collaboration with the Magazine Committee of the Department of Political Science, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi. The theme of today's session is India-China relations and the current world order anxieties. To help us navigate this integrated landscape, we are incredibly honored to host Dr. Rityusha Mani Tiwary. Welcome, ma'am.
Dr. Tiwary is a distinguished scholar whose expertise sits at very heart of these issues. She teaches at the Department of Political Science here at Shaheed Bhagat Singh College and serves as an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, ICS, Delhi. Since 2016, she has also been the assistant editor of China Report, the flagship journal of East Asian Studies.
With a PhD in Chinese Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. Tiwary's research explores the interplay of leadership, power, and hegemony. Her work is globally recognized. She has been a recipient of the visiting program for the young sinologists in Beijing, the International Visitor Leadership Program by the US State Department, and the Pivot Fellowship at the University of Cambridge. Ma'am, we are eager to learn from your insight into how India and China dynamic is fueling or responding to current global anxieties. We are extremely grateful to have you as the convener of YPC SBSC.
Without any further ado, I invite Dr. Tiwary to the discussion, to the audience. Please keep your notes ready as we'll have a dedicated Q&A segment following the presentation. Dr. Tiwary, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Yashasvi and Kunika. And thank you for the Public Policy YLACs Club for inviting me for this discussion.
So, ma'am, first question which we would like to place. In the light of China's advocacy for the global multipolar order, while simultaneously appearing to consolidate strategic dominance in Asia, is there a risk that India and the other global South powers could become quasi-vassal states, constrained within an emerging great power rivalry? Also, how can the middle powers safeguard agency in the potential neo-bipolar environment?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, when we say that China's advocacy of a multipolar world is there, I think, if any emerging power or rising power is basically advocating for multipolarity, it is obviously expected of them because they are the ones who are intervening in the current global order, as it were. And it is also extremely attractive to global South as a whole because it promises the diffusion of the existing power dominance, which is as of now traditionally held by the Western powers. So it becomes attractive both ways. It is attractive for the country who's rising, which is rising, and it is attractive for the rest of the global South. However, having said that, I would like to make that point that the structural risk still exists. The structural risk is not really the classical bipolarity as it existed during the Cold War era. It is that of the hierarchical multipolarity that might emerge because there is asymmetric interdependence. As of now, when it comes to analyzing the relationship that is there between the rising powers of the global South and the rest of the global South countries, they have asymmetric interdependence over each other. And since this asymmetric interdependence exists, it is possible that the multipolarity that will emerge due to the intervention of a rising power like China, or to a large extent, other rising powers, say, for instance, the BRICS countries, this hierarchical multipolarity would emerge as a structural risk for the rest of the global South. So your concern or the question that you raised about vassal state, the concern of the vassal state, it emerges from this particular structural risk, where infrastructure corridor, or say digital ecosystems, or supply chain dependencies, or financial exposure to the rising power, such as China, might create certain structural leverages in favor of China. And in such a system, formal sovereignty, even though it remains intact for the rest of the engaging participating countries, the policy space narrows down. And the constraint is therefore first economic, and later on it also becomes strategic. For India and other powers, the key safeguard is not perhaps the alignment, but strategic diversification. So one is not really arguing in favor of alignment, but in terms of diversification, it is very much needed. So where all do we diversify, from a policy perspective? The diversification is definitely needed in terms of trade and capital flows. Also diversification in terms of avoiding single source technology ecosystems, uh, maintaining autonomous defense industrial capacity. So these are the key areas. And I think additionally one could also talk about issue based coalition, rather than some sort of block politics emerging. So even when global south is talking amongst themselves, there needs to be an understanding that this is also a largely issue based coalition, rather than something which resembles block politics. So within the global south cohort, the middle powers, like BRICS, or rising powers like BRICS, they retain agency when they avoid binary position and operate through a sort of mini lateral institutional layering that happens within the global south, engaging with the US, engaging with Western other Western countries, engaging with EU, engaging with Canada, engaging with Russia, BRICS, Quad, so institutional multi-layering as well as minilateralism. So this would sort of take care of the emergent dangers of structural asymmetry or over dependence, or having that kind of safeguard in mind. And because the real danger is not multipolarity, it is having over dependence without having any kind of leverage.
Ma'am, that was quite insightful. My second question to you would be that with India set to host the 2026 BRICS Summit, how can India and China manage their bilateral tensions to ensure that strategic rivalry does not undermine multilateral platforms such as BRICS, which are intended to amplify the collective policy of the Global South during the ongoing transition toward multipolarity?
Okay, so yes, India is set to host the BRICS summit in 2026. I think the central issue is very much about being able to compartmentalize. When you have relations with China, there is definitely unresolved border dispute. There is also the continuation of a long, protracted strategic mistrust that both the sides have against each other. But let's remember one thing: BRICS is not a bilateral forum. It is a systemic platform. It is a multilateral systemic platform. So if the bilateral rivalry of India and China spills into BRICS, the global south loses a negotiating platform, a negotiating instrument. And this would be very detrimental for the entire global south, because this is a transitional moment in world order. So the solution therefore lies in compartmentalization. At least a three-pronged strategy is required. When you have issue-based compartmentalization, that means keep the issue of the border insulated from other multilateral and institutional engagements and cooperative possibilities with China. Second, also focus on the functional agenda setting. So BRICS needs to focus, and India within BRICS needs to focus on certain functional aspects and their agenda setting. When I say agenda setting, we students of international relations, we know that agenda setting is as important as having actual material capabilities. So A, you have the capabilities, B, you want to use those capabilities, and three, you know how best to use that capability. So I'm talking about the third, possibility here, which is how best to use a particular capability. So within BRICS, there needs to be a focus on functional agenda setting. And I say functional agenda setting, it means that you talk about certain very important core functions, like development of finance reform, that you want at world order level, global south's own credit architecture. I mean, these are the functions that you want to claim for yourself. You want to change these functions as they exist in the global regimes today. So you want to change the finance structure, you want to change the credit structure, you want to change digital public infrastructure, access to that digital public infrastructure. And you also want to change climate adaptation funding, where the funding is coming from regarding issues of climate. So all of these areas are areas where largely every country in the global south uh, converges in terms of their individual interests. So there is a possibility of setting a collective functional agenda together within the BRICS. And I think the focus should be there. So that's the second part. The third part is, of course, just strengthen the institution. Instead of BRICS remaining just a symbolic coming together of the global south, I think institutions within the BRICS or institutions which come out of the BRICS need to be strengthened. We can talk about new development bank. We can talk about payment mechanisms of the global south. We can talk about currency settlement experiments. Instead of simply just adopting that symbolic anti-western language, perhaps prioritizing these institutions and strengthening these institutions is required. And I think here India's role is extremely important. As a host, it must shape BRICS as a platform for structured reform rather than any kind of simply a ideological rhetoric about countering the bloc politics of the West.
Ma'am, that was a really great insight regarding the collective functional agenda as well as how we can strengthen BRICS as an institution rather than causing an anti Western idea. Now, my third question would be amid escalating US and China tensions, is India genuinely maintaining its strategic autonomy, or is it inevitably being positioned as a counterbalancing power or force in the Asian regional order?
Okay. Okay, when it comes to talking about strategic autonomy, yeah, there's been a lot of literature, there's been a lot of understanding about what India is doing today in terms of its foreign policy, and labeling that as strategic autonomy. On the one hand, it participates in the Quad. It is also deepening its ties with the US, has multiple technology partnerships, yet has defense engagements with Russia, purchasing defense products from Russia. It also remains active in the BRICS and SCO, and at the same time, there is also an aversion to alliance, any kind of military alliance, as it were. So the structural reality here is that all of these things that India's foreign policy is reflecting as possibilities of strategic autonomy, maintaining issue-based coalition and engagement. The structural reality is that US-China rivalry creates gravitational pulls, and India cannot really escape this kind of gravitational pull, yet it resists any kind of formal alignment because there is US China rivalry, there is a lot of uncertainty, and there is also drawing of borders, like drawing of ranks. We call it like you draw the rank, so one understands where one stands, whether one stands with the US or one stands with China. Now, obviously, in this whole thing, how sustainable is India China relationship? Even that emerges as a very big concern, because we have a paradox. We have deep trade interdependence, but we also have persistent military standoffs. We have protracted unresolved boundary disputes. And we also have strategic mistrust. I mean, the term strategic mistrust cannot be used anymore vehemently as much as it is used in case of India-China relations. So the relationship is likely competitive. It is also to a certain extent cooperative when we look at trade, but it's not reconciled. It's neither a fully reconciled relationship, nor is it a totally collapsed kind of a engagement. Trade continues, border management mechanisms are evolved to stabilize the crisis at the border. Trust remains thin. So, long term sustainability perhaps depends on three factors. One would be whether India and China together can restore border stability mechanisms, to their fullest potential. Second, whether the military signaling and posturing that India and China have vis a vis each other, whether that can be managed in a more stable manner. And third would be, avoiding any kind of decoupling just because there is systemic hostility. I mean, if you decouple because of technological advancement. You decouple because you have possibilities of diverse engagements. You don't decouple as a reaction. I mean, if it's a simple reactionary decoupling because of systemic hostility that these two countries have with each other, then that decoupling is unstable. It is not something which bears positive results. It is also not, you know, efficient. It is because it's a reaction. It's not a natural process. So it's definitely going to be very unstable. It is going to be painful. It is also going to be perhaps not very result oriented. And we saw that post Galwan, app ban and trade. Not doing that much of volume of trade with China, and that whole idea that one can decouple at one's own whims and fancies, and when one pleases because the other partner is not really is actually antagonistic, so you would like to simply walk out. Doesn't happen. The system doesn't support it. There's a lot of anxiety. So systemic hostility giving rise to decoupling is not a good thing. Decoupling happening as a natural process because of technological advancement or diversification, a much more plausible, more welcome scenario. So it's not simply partnership in the sense we see other bilaterals. I think it's a multi-structured rivalry, but there is also a bounded engagement. So I mean, that's the long and short of India-China relations in my sense. So the sustainability question, as you raised, is actually dependent on these kind of considerations. I don't know if I've been able to satisfy your question, satisfy your query entirely, but yeah, this is how I see.
Ma'am, that was really a new perspective and a quite objective one. We got to learn a lot, and it was realistic too in nature. So, as the next question, I would like to ask, drawing on more than a decade of scholarship in China studies, does the field in India receive adequate institutional support and intellectual investment? What policy reforms, funding mechanisms, language training initiatives, or research collaborations could strengthen analytical depth and policy relevance?
Well, that's almost like inviting the agony aunt to answer certain questions that you find as problematic. When we start talking about India and China, there is a lot of generic talk about, in general, about India's foreign policy, but there's also there's a rampant preponderance. There's a rampant tendency to have very generic talk about India China too. India's China scholarship is actually very less in critical numbers. It is intellectually rich, but it's less because there is institutional undersupporting, as you mentioned. We have very few centers of studies for China, and we face limited or limitations regarding long-term funding. We have definitely insufficient Mandarin language pipelines that can feed into these Center for Chinese Studies. We also have weak research methodology and, archival and field access. So methodology is not strong. Access to that methodology is also not easy. And definitely we have very fragmented policy academic industry linkage when it comes to looking at India China studies. So for a country which is facing one of the most complex bilaterals of its foreign policy, this then becomes a structural vulnerability. It leaves India in a very vulnerable situation because it doesn't know who it is supposed to deal with. So, the reforms regarding India and China studies should definitely include dedicated national funding for China focused research clusters, long term language fellowships. One cannot really emphasize enough on that. And definitely integration of, different areas about knowing China. When you're doing China research, it is not just India China relations. Of course, there's comparative, but there is that this entire idea that it's holistically knowing China. So if you're a China studies scholar, you're supposed to know what's the science and tech scene in China, what is the political economy scene in China, um, what is the literature popular culture scene in China, what is the military studies saying. You could be an expert in one of those domains, but you cannot simply be an expert in just one domain. You need to know, basics of other domains too, and develop niche areas. One is not taking away the specialization argument. One is saying that specialization needs to be done, definitely, but also having an idea as to what's happening in the other domain of Chinese studies. Have structured 1.5, track 1.5 or track 2 dialogues with institutional continuity on either side. So, we all are here in Delhi University. How many of you know how many of engagements does Delhi University have, for instance, with its counterparts in China? So Chinese studies cannot really be episodic. It cannot be, just as a matter of chance. It needs to be institutionalized because it's also a part of strategic knowledge infrastructure. Without epistemic depth, if you have a policy which doesn't have the backing of the entire knowledge infrastructure, then that policy is weak. And that is what happens in case of, our policy, many areas of our policy making in international relation or foreign policy, China studies being one of them.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very insightful regarding how Chinese study can be pursued by the students and how it can be used for policy making as well. Next question would be, how has China's Belt and Road Initiative evolved by the 2026 in terms of scale, financing models, and geopolitical ambition? What calibrated strategy should India adopt to balance or counter BRI's influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region without exacerbating regional tensions?
Okay. Yeah. So any discussion on China and India is not really complete without bringing BRI. By we are in the year 2026. The whole talk formally started in 2013. BRI came out as a strategy. It has evolved from being a very expansive mega project of diplomacy to a more selective, risk calibrated, financially disciplined, overture from Chinese foreign policy. And we can see three very important shifts in BRI. It is, you know, it was mega in its focus earlier, but now it's more focused on sustainability. And I think that point has been made by a lot of studies. There are more smaller, commercially viable projects as part of BRI. So they are not looking at scale so much as they are looking at sustainability. So that's one shift. The second shift is, of course, that now you know, there's a reflection of blended financial models. So you have multilateral co-financing and local currency engagements working side by side to basically implement these projects which are under BRI. And the third shift is that you earlier had a lot of focus emphasis on digital Silk Route, or the digital aspect of BRI. Now the focus is on, again, as I said, sustainability. So focus is on green infrastructural narratives emanating out of BRI. So geopolitically, of course, BRI is now less about grand expansion, more about consolidating the gains of strategic engagements in terms of nodes, infrastructural nodes like logistics, ports, energy corridors, um, in general digital infrastructure as well. So that's the way BRI has shifted. Now, what could be India's responses? I think from day one, most of the scholars and policymakers who read things in a long term perspective, not just as a part of knee jerk reaction, emphasize that India's responses cannot be simply reactive containment. Instead, it should be looking at possibilities of connecting its own neighborhood. So strengthening neighborhood connectivity through, say, we have existing mechanisms like BIMSTEC, IMEC type of corridor, or say BBIN corridor. So these are the possibilities of neighborhood connectivity, and I think one should be looking at strengthening that. Also, with the pandemic and its after effects, I think the idea of regional, development as a holistic part of our own policy cannot be any more marginalized. We need to invest at the regional level in terms of development and finance. So that's a very important aspect. Looking at the region per se, and of course, when there is China, which is offering, infrastructural expansion and projects and investments through BRI, and we have also seen it's working. We've seen the responses to it. We are also in a position to offer alternatives which are more transparent, which have less of the loopholes that are now being pointed out in BRI projects. And also look at demand. I mean, where is the demand for these kind of alternatives? Which is the sector that we can plug in? So that's the third aspect. And I think finally, of course, bridging that gap between ASEAN and Africa. We can offer a lot in terms of bridging the gap between ASEAN and Africa, developing infrastructural partnerships and so on and so forth. And that is where also the Indian Ocean region comes. So being the dominant presence in Indian Ocean region, we can be that bridge between ASEAN and Africa. So I think we should not let go of that leverage. So competitive provisioning of alternatives at regional level is the one line that I will summarize for India's response to BRI.
Ma'am, that was really insightful about the BRI and India's counter initiatives. Now, the next question would be, in the context of intensifying technological and digital competition between India and China, what role can academic institutions, think tanks, and track two dialogues play in reducing misperceptions, mitigating strategic mistrust, and fostering structured channels of engagement?
Okay. Okay, so let's break down this question a little bit. It was quite long and I lost some part of it, but it's okay. Um, okay, so when we say tech competition, what really is tech competition? When you say technology, I think technology rivalry is emerging as one of the very contentious, dangerous frontiers, because it brings in things from economics, from security, also to a large extent, this whole talk about ideology. How do you use the technology? What purpose are you using the technology for? Technology drives growth, or growth gives rise to a certain kind of technology? I mean, all of those debates about ideology and ethics of technology. So it's fusing these multiple concerns, the idea of tech rivalry or tech competition. You talk about critical emergent technologies like AI or semiconductors or, say, telecom infrastructure, You also have this whole version of governance, digital governance, and therefore the different kind of models. And these are not anymore they are not really neutral domains. These are very politically charged, ideologically charged, ethically debated domains. And in such an environment, of course, your question was about tech rivalry and what can we be doing, right?
Yeah, ma'am. Think tanks and other policy.
I'll say that what can the intellectual class or the academia or civil society could be doing, so let's plug in this thing with foreign policy, because you are essentially a policy oriented discursive group, right? So what does the civil society do? What does the intellectual class do? What do we do as part of track 2 processes of the foreign policy? you know um, I think there are at least few very critical functions that I can think of. First one would be, we have a clarity epistemically. Epistemic is the knowledge, the body of knowledge that we build around these things. So epistemic clarity about what is political rhetoric and what is really a security concern when you talk about tech rivalry. So political rhetoric, you keep avoiding, and you just focus on what is really the security risk. You clarify it, you bring that knowledge to forefront. Second would be, if there is a crisis, if tech rivalry of the day will be even more dangerous than of the Cold War era. So if there is a crisis, do we have enough de-escalation channels? That's the most important thing to focus on, maintaining communication when when we see hurdles in formal diplomacy. So whether we have developed those mechanisms where we can de-escalate, that's important, because otherwise it's annihilation, due to the kind of technology that has developed in the last 100 years. So that's the second most important thing. The third important thing is, and these channels are us, the track 2, the intellectual class, the civil society, the academia, think tanks, research institutes, um, universities. So the third thing would be to contribute into norm shaping dialogues around technology rivalry or tech competition. These norm shaping dialogues should be based on shared understandings of AI ethics, data governance, what is a public good and what is a digital public good. So a shared concern on these questions. Universities, think tanks, academia, these are the best places to develop these shared structured dialogues about cyber norms, what we should be looking at in terms of cyber norms, what is AI safety, what is really a supply chain resilience in technology, and what is the standard setting for non-sensitive domains. So when we have cooperation in non-sensitive domains of technology, how do we really standardize them? So I think this this is important. Otherwise, what happens is that the rivalry slash competition, like slash mistrust, starts growing fastest. Track 2 mechanisms, where academia, research institute, think tanks are located, they are the mechanisms where you have some sort of control over disagreement spilling into a very disastrous result. So when we have a lot of technology diffusion, technology fragmentation, intellectual engagement is a very, very important form of preventive diplomacy, and that should be nurtured.
Ma'am, it was really interesting to hear regarding how technology has a dynamic approach in even our political relationship. Now, next question would be, drawing from the historical perceptions of China as the sick man of Asia during its century of humiliation in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Where do you think India has lagged in its development trajectory compared to China, given that both the countries achieve independence around the same time?
um okay. I don't agree with the sick man of Asia terminology at all. That's historically referred to China from the colonial powers, and when there was a decline of Qing dynasty in the early part of 20th century or the last part of 19th century, it was used to basically highlight the inefficacy of uh, internal politics, instability, or the stagnation that Chinese society was undergoing at large. It is also a marker of, calling the other civilization weak, and India has not been labeled in this manner, but India has also been labeled as, we have our own crosses to bear. So, that entire thing, that entire knowledge systems and knowledge productions of India can be confined to one small shelf of Cambridge University. That kind of very brute comparison about what has really been the epistemic tradition in India versus the epistemic traditions of the West. I think that is also somewhat similar to, calling China a sick man of Asia. So, but enough on that. The question really is that, why is there a difference in the development trajectories of India and China? And since we both began rebuilding and recalibrating around similar timelines, 1947, 1949, I think the political systems that emerged in 1947 in India, the political system that emerged here was more based on democratic parliamentary representational form of government. In China, on the other hand, it became a more centralized one party system. And therefore, the sense that, how you fragment power, how you fragment, therefore, decision making, how you ensure separation of jurisdiction, separation of powers and responsibilities, and introduce checks and balances, all of these mechanisms were laid out in a different manner in case of both India and China. And therefore, since the decision making power was laid out in a very different manner in the two different political systems, of course, the way policies got implemented, from a policy perspective, the way policies got implemented were rather different and interesting. If you compare the 60s in China, if you compare the 60s in India, there's a hell lot of a difference. I mean, it's very different as to what was happening in our 5-year plan, even though we had almost similar objectives. Like any post-colonial development oriented discourse here in India, of course, you had the discourse on development, mixed economy, how best to really bring the how to bring the best of the both the worlds, and that kind of debate. But that debate didn't exist in China. The debate was more about how best to implement socialism. So they already had one, specific goal in mind, and how best to go to that goal was also more or less understood in a more concrete political process kind of a way. Here, on the other hand, the political process was multi-layered, was more fragmented, was also much more open to debate and discussion. So the 60s become a very interesting discursive decade for India and China development discourse. The 70s are, again, it's if it's unstable in India, it's also very unstable in China, because slowly Mao's era is getting over. You have 78 then happening. You have that whole recalibration with US, because USSR China schism has happened. So it's very happening decade for both India and China. And then, of course, the consolidation starts, 80s. But in case of India, the consolidation is slower, more again, more fragmented. We enter into an era of coalition politics slowly, from one party rule to coalition politics. In case of China, from Maoist era, now it's Tangist era. Deng Xiaoping has come to power, and has opened up the system systematically, not really like the USSR, but very, very strategically. And the idea is to now bring in state capitalism, so that the foundations for modernization, for development, can be really laid out, and bringing people out from poverty and so on and so forth. So what really differed was perhaps the way decision making is embedded in the political system, um, and therefore the trajectory that you really chart out for yourself is not along similar signposts. You travel a different road to reach the same goal. I mean, in simpler language, if you both had to really reach from place A to B, you may take a different kind of route, and your counterpart might take a very different kind of route. So experiences will differ. You might see a different road altogether, and they may have traveled from a very different road. So experiences may really differ, and based on those experiences, your future, decisions also differ. So they have consolidated the gains of their opening up. I think the gains of our opening up of 1991 LPG were, again, they were not so spectacular as to the scale of what was happening in China. But I think it was also painful transition. But we also consolidated to a large extent. So the 21st century very rightly had been pitched as the Asian century because of the rise of big economies, China, the entire Southeast Asian cohort, as well as India. Where do we differ? I think the language can be less pessimistic. We differ a lot, but we also have very similar goals. So sometimes there will be convergences as to how best to reach that goal. Sometimes there will be very ardent disagreements, which is absolutely all right. I don't really necessarily view it as a very, very stark comparison. That's all.
Rightly said, ma'am. Thank you so much. We learned a lot from this podcast, and I'm sure our audience also has some of explicit insights as well. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. And to the viewers, we'll see you soon in our next podcast, and we request you all to follow our YouTube channel as well and stay connected for further.